There's a question that one of the most powerful religious institutions in America has never been able to answer. Not because the answer is complicated, but because the answer exists, and it destroys everything. Scientists ran the DNA. They mapped the genes. They traced the bloodlines across thousands of years and thousands of miles. And what they found did not just challenge a belief. It rewrote the entire origin story of an entire civilization. A story told to millions. A story taught to children. A story that was quietly, almost invisibly changed, one single word at a time. There's a moment in every scientific investigation when the data stops being numbers and starts being a verdict. The instruments don't care about faith. The sequencing machines don't read scripture. They read nucleotides. They read ancient molecular signatures locked inside human cells for thousands of years, patiently waiting for someone to ask the right question. And when scientists finally asked that question about the origins of Native Americans, when they turned the full weight of modern genetic technology toward the landmass we call the Americas, what they found didn't just answer a question. It detonated one. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what was claimed in the first place. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one of the fastest growing and most institutionally powerful religious organizations in the United States, built a significant portion of its theological identity around a specific, audacious, and deeply detailed historical claim. Not a metaphor, not a parable. An actual historical claim about real people, real migrations, real civilizations. According to the foundational scripture of the faith, the Book of Mormon, a family from Jerusalem sailed to the Americas around 600 BC. Their descendants split into two great nations, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And those Lamanites, the scripture declared, became the principal ancestors of the American Indians. That was the claim. Written clearly, taught explicitly, repeated for generations. Think about what that means. It means that the indigenous people of an entire continent, millions of human beings with thousands of years of culture, language, art, and survival, were told that their deepest ancestral roots traced not to Asia, not to the ancient migrations most of humanity accepted as history, but to the ancient Middle East, to Jerusalem, to a specific family, to a specific story. And for over a century and a half, that claim stood, not because it was proven, but because no tool existed powerful enough to challenge it, until the tools arrived. Here is where the story begins to crack open. Modern population genetics did not emerge overnight. It was built slowly, painstakingly, through decades of laboratory work, fossil analysis, mitochondrial sequencing, and Y chromosome mapping. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, scientists had assembled enough data to make definitive statements about where human populations originated. And those statements, drawn from the DNA of over 15,000 indigenous American individuals from more than 200 tribes spread across North, Central, and South America, pointed in one direction. Not to the Middle East, not to Jerusalem, not to 600 BC. They pointed east, far east, to Siberia, to ancient migrations across a land bridge that once connected Asia to Alaska, to a journey that began not 600 years before the birth of Christ, but somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 years ago. But here's where it gets worse. The genetic evidence wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't a close call. When researchers examined the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line of Native American populations, they found 5 major haplogroups. Scientists label these genetic clusters with letters A, B, C, D, and X. Approximately 99% of all Native American maternal lineages fall within one of these 5 categories. And every single one of them, everyone, traces its origin back to Siberia and East Asia. Not to the ancient Near East, not to Israel, not to any population that would have been walking the streets of Jerusalem in 600 BC. The molecular fingerprints were unambiguous. The ancestry trail was clear, and the conclusion was inescapable. The first Americans came from Asia, and they came thousands of years before the Book of Mormon's timeline even begins. Now pause, because this is the moment where the story becomes not just scientific, but deeply human. Among the scientists who confronted this data was a man who had every reason to want a different answer. Simon Southerton was not a hostile outsider. He was not a critic looking for ammunition. He was a plant geneticist, yes, but more importantly, he was a faithful Latter-day Saint. He had served a 2-year mission. He had been married in the temple. He had served in leadership positions within his congregation for decades. He was, by every measure, a committed member of the community whose founding scripture he was now studying through the lens of molecular biology. And he began that study expecting confirmation. He looked for the genetic signature of ancient Israelites in Native American DNA, the way you look for a familiar face in a crowd, fully expecting to find it. He didn't find it. What he found instead, after years of analysis, was that Native American DNA was, as he would later describe it, almost 100% of Asiatic origin. No Middle Eastern markers, no ancient Semitic signature, No trace of the genetic legacy that would have been left behind by a family migrating from Jerusalem and founding civilizations that lasted for 1,000 years. The data was not offering him a nuanced interpretation. It was handing him a verdict. And this is where everything changes. Southerton did what any scientist is trained to do. He followed the data. He wrote a book, Losing a Lost Tribe, Native Americans, DNA, and the Mormon Church, in which he laid out the genetic evidence in detail and argued that it directly contradicted the historical claims of the Book of Mormon. His conclusion was not aggressive. It was clinical. The DNA, he said, simply did not support the narrative. And the narrative, as it had been taught for generations, was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of record. The introduction to the Book of Mormon, added in 1981, stated it plainly. The Lamanites are the principal ancestors of the American Indians, not among the ancestors, the principal ancestors, the primary source, the foundation. What happened next is one of the most revealing chapters in the intersection of science and institutional religion in modern American history. In 2006, quietly, without press conference, without announcement, without any public acknowledgement of why the change was being made, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints changed one word in the introduction to the Book of Mormon, one single word. Principal became among. The Lamanites, it now read, are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Not the principal ancestors, just among them. A subtle linguistic retreat that, to a casual reader, might seem like editorial refinement. But to anyone paying attention to the scientific context in which it occurred, it was something far more significant. It was an institution quietly, almost invisibly, acknowledging that the genetic evidence had made the old claim untenable. Read that again. One word. Changed without explanation. In one of the most sacred texts of one of the most powerful religious organizations in the United States, and almost nobody noticed. The shift from principal to among might seem minor until you understand what it erases. For over a century, church leaders had not described the Lamanite connection to Native Americans as incidental or partial. Former church president Spencer W. Kimball made clear statements throughout his leadership that Native Americans primarily descended from Lehi's family. Missionaries taught this. Sunday school classes reinforced it. Generations of Latter-day Saint children grew up understanding that the indigenous people of the Americas were the Lamanites, direct primary descendants of a biblical migration from the ancient Near East. That understanding was not a footnote. It was a cornerstone. And in 2006, without fanfare, without explanation, that cornerstone was quietly moved. But the scientific community didn't stop at the 2006 edition. The data kept coming. Research published across the following decade only deepened the genetic consensus. A landmark analysis examining genetic variation across 29 Native American populations, spanning North, Central, and South America, confirmed that genetic diversity decreased the further populations moved from the Bering Strait. This is exactly the pattern you would expect to see in populations that originated at that point and migrated outward. The genomic signature of a founding bottleneck, a small group of people giving rise to an entire continental population, was unmistakable in the data. And that founding event traced back, without exception, to ancient Siberian populations who crossed into Alaska somewhere between 12,000 and 25,000 years ago. Not 600 BC, not from the Middle East, thousands of years before that story even begins. What most people are not seeing is that this isn't just a religious controversy. It's a question about who gets to define history and whose origins get to be rewritten. The Lemba people of southern Africa offer an instructive contrast. This African tribe had maintained an oral tradition for generations claiming Jewish ancestry. Many dismissed this as myth. Then scientists ran the DNA. They found the Cohen modal haplotype, a specific Y chromosome marker strongly associated with Jewish priestly lineage, present in the Lemba at rates far exceeding chance. The oral tradition was confirmed. The genetic fingerprint matched the claimed ancestry. This is what the evidence looks like when a historical migration claim is accurate. You can find the genetic signature. It persists. It survives across centuries. Simon Southerton pointed to this very example and asked the obvious question. If Jewish ancestry could be detected in an African tribe through genetic testing, why can't Middle Eastern ancestry be detected in Native Americans? If the Book of Mormon account is historically accurate? The answer, according to every independent geneticist who has examined the evidence, is because there is no Middle Eastern ancestry to detect. Now, the Church and its scholars have offered responses to this challenge. These responses are important to understand, not dismiss. The most sophisticated argument among LDS apologists is what researchers call the limited geography theory. The idea that Lehi's family arrived in a small, specific region, intermarried with existing indigenous populations who were already there, and that their genetic contribution was therefore diluted to undetectable levels over centuries of mixing. This theory argues that the Book of Mormon was never meant to describe a hemispheric, continent-wide civilization, but rather a local story involving a small group that merged into a much larger existing population. This argument deserves serious engagement, and serious geneticists have provided it. The problem with the dilution argument is mathematical. For a genetic contribution to become genuinely undetectable across an entire hemisphere, the original founding population would need to have been so small and the existing indigenous population so enormous that the founding group would have essentially disappeared genetically within a few generations. But the Book of Mormon itself does not describe a small family that quietly dissolved into a sea of millions. It describes civilizations, cities, wars involving hundreds of thousands of combatants, rapid population growth over centuries, a society large enough to build temples, maintain written records, and wage wars that resulted in the literal extinction of entire nations. The scale of civilization described in the text is fundamentally incompatible with a population small enough to leave no genetic trace. You cannot have it both ways. Either the civilization was large enough to matter historically, and would therefore have left detectable genetic evidence, or it was too small to have left evidence, in which case it was too small to have built what the text describes. According to informed sources in the field of population genetics, the science continues to become more precise, not less. Ancient DNA research, analyzing genetic material extracted from archaeological remains thousands of years old, has added a new dimension to the discussion. Whole genome sequencing of ancient Mayan remains consistently shows Asian ancestry, not Middle Eastern ancestry. The genetic record of ancient civilizations in Mesoamerica, the region most commonly proposed as the geographical setting of the Book of Mormon, shows no disruption consistent with a founding migration from the ancient Near East in 600 BC. The lineages are continuous, the ancestry is consistent. And the Asian origin of American populations is, in the words of geneticist Jamie Hannes Handy, herself a member of the LDS faith, like watching a photograph load. The picture becomes clearer over time, not more ambiguous. And then there's the question that the one-word change of 2006 raised and never answered. If the introduction of the Book of Mormon as published in 1981 was incorrect, if the Lamanites were not, in fact, the principal ancestors of Native Americans, then who approved that introduction? It was added by LDS Apostle Bruce R. McConkie, with the full authority of the church's leadership at the time. Church leadership has since stated that the introduction was not part of the original text, translated by Joseph Smith, but for 25 years, millions of members read that introduction as authoritative. Missionaries carried it into homes across the world. It was the first thing a new reader encountered when opening the Book of Mormon, and in 2006, it was changed, quietly, mysteriously, with no explanation offered to the members whose faith had been shaped by the version they'd been given. This is not chaos, this is management, because what happened after 2006 was not a clean resolution. The change sparked its own controversy. Members who had built their understanding of indigenous peoples, who had gone on missions to Native American communities specifically because of the Lamanite narrative, suddenly found the doctrinal foundation of that identity shifted without warning. Critics argued that the change revealed something deeper, that the church was capable of revising its scriptural apparatus in response to external pressure, scientific pressure, without openly acknowledging that pressure existed. Supporters argued that the change was a clarification, not a capitulation, that the church had always taught a more nuanced view than the critics claimed, that Joseph Smith himself never definitively stated that Lehi's family were the only inhabitants of the Americas. But the real story is in what was never said. The 2014 publication of a formal gospel topics essay by the church, a significant step toward institutional transparency, acknowledged the genetic problem directly. The essay admitted that DNA evidence places Native American origins in Asia, not the Middle East. It acknowledged that finding genetic evidence of Lehi's family specifically would be extraordinarily difficult given the complexity of ancient populations. It acknowledged that nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples. These are remarkable admissions for an institution whose scripture once declared unambiguously that those very peoples were the principal ancestors of an entire continent's indigenous population. But the essay also stopped well short of saying the Book of Mormon was historically inaccurate. It offered the tools of ambiguity, population mixing, genetic drift, limited geography, to create space between the scientific evidence and the theological claim. What most people are not seeing is the real cost of that space. The individuals most affected by this debate are not theologians or geneticists. They are Native Americans. They are indigenous people who were told, sometimes by missionaries who arrived in their communities in the 20th century, that they were Lamanites, that their ancestors had sailed from Jerusalem, that their skin color, according to certain readings of the Book of Mormon, was a mark placed upon them as a consequence of their ancestors' spiritual failures. The phrase, white and delightsome, It is describing the supposed eventual transformation of the Lamanites appeared in LDS scripture and teaching for generations before being changed to pure and delightsome in 1981. The racial theology embedded in the Lamanite narrative was not a minor doctrinal detail. For indigenous communities who encountered the LDS missionary program at scale, it was a fundamental reordering of their identity, and the genetic evidence that dismantled that narrative did not arrive with an apology. It arrived with a footnote in a Gospel Topics essay and a one-word change in an introduction that most casual readers would never notice. Think about what that means. Think about what it costs a community to have its origin story replaced, not by a more accurate story offered with humility and care, but by a quiet institutional revision designed to minimize doctrinal exposure. And now, the science keeps moving. Recent research published in Current Biology has shown that ancient Native Americans actually migrated back across the Bering Strait into Siberia, not just forward into the Americas, but backward, carrying their genetic signatures into eastern Eurasia thousands of years ago. This discovery adds a new layer of complexity to our understanding of ancient migrations and confirms that the human story in the Americas is far older, far more dynamic, and far more deeply rooted in Asian ancestry than any competing theory has suggested. Scientists have now recovered ancient DNA from individuals as old as 7,500 years, and every data point tells the same story. Asia, Siberia, the Bering Strait, not Jerusalem, not 600 BC. According to informed sources and ongoing genetic research, the 5 haplogroups, A, B, C, D, and X, that account for 99% of Native American maternal lineages have been studied with increasing precision over decades of expanding research. Each of these haplogroups has been traced to its geographic origin. Haplogroups A, C, and D are found in Siberia. Haplogroup B is common in Southeast Asia. Haplogroup X, the one that some LDS scholars have pointed to as potential evidence of Middle Eastern ancestry because it also appears in European and North African populations, has been exhaustively analyzed. The specific variant found in Native Americans, X2A, is not the same as the Middle Eastern variant. Its ancestral lineage is approximately 30,000 years old. Its presence in the Americas traces back to ancient Siberian populations, not to the ancient Near East. The argument has been raised repeatedly. It has been evaluated thoroughly. It has been rejected by the scientific consensus, including by LDS scholars who have examined the evidence honestly. The real story is not whether one haplogroup opens a door to a different interpretation. The real story is what it tells us about how institutions respond when the data challenges them. Because here is the question that should be sitting heavy in every thinking person's mind. If a claim is true, why does it need to be quietly revised? If the Lamanites were always meant to be among the ancestors of Native Americans and not the principal ancestors, why was it written as principal in the first place? Why was it taught that way for generations? Why were missionaries sent specifically to Native American communities on the basis of a theological identity that the institution has since walked back? And why was the walk back done in silence, without announcement, without pastoral guidance for the millions of members who had built understanding of the world on the version they'd been given? What is also unresolved is this. The Gospel Topics essay on DNA and the Book of Mormon acknowledge that the science is complex. And that is true. Population genetics is not simple. Ancient migrations are not always traceable. Genetic drift, founder effects, and population bottlenecks can obscure ancestral origins in ways that even sophisticated tools cannot fully penetrate. There is genuine scientific humility required in this field. But there is a difference between scientific humility, acknowledging the limits of what can be proven, and theological evasion, using those limits to protect a claim that the evidence does not support. The consensus of independent, non-LDS geneticists on this question is not uncertain. It is not divided. When 3 geneticists sat down on the Mormon Stories podcast to respond to the Church's Gospel Topics essay on DNA, the conclusion was the same across all 3. The genetic evidence is not compatible with the historical claims as traditionally understood, and this is what sits at the center of the entire debate, unresolved and unaddressed. The Book of Mormon is not a document that describes itself as symbolic. It does not present itself as parable. It presents itself as history. It names specific people. It names specific places. It describes specific events spanning 1,000 years. Joseph Smith did not say he received an inspired metaphor. He said he translated an actual ancient record from actual gold plates delivered to him by an actual angel. That specificity is not a minor doctrinal detail. It is the foundation of the entire religious claim. And when science examines the physical, measurable, genetic record of the people whom that history claims to describe, and finds no trace of the ancestry that history requires, the response cannot simply be a quiet, one-word change, and an essay that concludes with ambiguity. What most people are not seeing is that this is bigger than religion. This is about what it means to be honest with the people who trust you. It is about what institutions owe the communities they shape. It is about whether the discovery of truth even inconvenient truth, is treated as an opportunity for transparency or as a problem to be managed. Because the scientists ran the DNA, the instruments did not care about faith. The haplogroups did not bend toward a preferred narrative. The ancient genetic signatures of 15,000 individuals from 200 tribes across 2 continents told a story that has been forming for 30,000 years. A story of migration from Siberia, of survival across a land bridge, of populations spreading south through a continent that had never heard of Jerusalem. And somewhere in Salt Lake City in 2006, a single word was changed. Not in a press release, not in a sermon, not in a public reckoning with what the data had revealed. Just quietly, in an introduction that most members had memorized, in a text that millions considered sacred, the word principle was removed, and in its place came among, and no explanation followed. The question that remains is not whether the science is clear. It is. The question is what happens next. Inside the institution, inside the communities that were shaped by the old narrative, inside the minds of millions of faithful people who have not yet been told what was changed, or why, or what it means for everything else they were taught alongside it. Because if one foundational claim can be quietly revised without explanation, what else is waiting for a one-word change? What else is sitting in the introduction, in the footnotes, in the teachings passed from generation to generation that the instruments have not yet had the chance to examine? And when those instruments speak, as they always do, as they always have, who will be listening? And who will be the one to quietly change the word? The DNA doesn't lie, but the silence around it does.